Welcome to the Deep Dive. I am truly excited to embark on another journey of discovery with you. Today, we're not just opening a book, we're delving into a fascinating and at times, frankly, perplexing legal battle that has courts, communities, and classrooms wrestling with some truly fundamental questions about free expression. It's a compelling look at who ultimately gets to decide what you read. In the school library in St. Tammany Parish, Louisiana, there was a book titled Voodoo and Hoodoo. On the surface, it seemed academic. The first half was a fairly standard historical account, tracing the evolution of voodoo practices in African-American communities, including right there in New Orleans. But it was the second half that caused the firestorm. Because the second half was, for all intents and purposes, a recipe book. Not for gumbo, but for spells. It was a how-to guide, outlining the steps for casting hexes, performing tricks, and bringing about specific desired events. The school board saw this, and they didn't see history or culture. They saw a dangerous instruction manual, and so they banned it. But that one decision to remove one book about spells from one library ignited a legal battle that would test the very foundation of a student's right to read. And it created a strange, winding precedent that, 30 years later, courts are still wrestling with today, as the fight over what you're allowed to find on a library shelf gets more intense than ever. Okay, let's unpack this. That Louisiana case, Campbell v. St. Tammany Parish School Board, from our opening. It might seem like just an isolated incident, right? A weird little story from decades ago.
Yeah, exactly. A historical footnote, maybe.
But when you look at the current climate, it becomes clear it was, well, more like a sign of things to come. A precursor to what we're seeing right now.
Definitely. The wave of censorship attempts we're seeing now is something else.
It really is. We are witnessing a truly rapid rise in these attempts across the country, especially hitting school and public libraries hard. I mean, the numbers are, frankly, staggering.
They really are. The American Library Association, the ALA, they reported over 1,200 challenges just to remove books in 2022 alone.
1,200. And just pause and think about that for a moment. That's nearly double the 729 challenges they reported back in 2021.
Right, so the pace isn't just picking up. It's exploding.
It really is.
So.
And when we look at where this is happening most intensely, Texas seems to be leading the charge, at least as of August 2023.
Yeah, Texas has been a real hot spot for these banning attempts.
Yeah. And what's really striking about these modern efforts is how deeply they seem to be tied into the whole culture wars political movement, the stuff that really gained steam after 2016.
Absolutely. These efforts are often spearheaded by, certain religious groups and the conservative right. They seem to perceive particular books, especially those dealing with race, gender, LGBTQ plus identity, as direct threats.
Threats to what they see as like traditional moral or social values.
Exactly. Or they see them as promoting ideologies they just fundamentally disagree with, or maybe just plain inappropriate for younger readers.
But, in a fascinating, almost ironic twist, it's not entirely one-sided, is it?
No, that's true. We've also seen instances of, retaliatory banning efforts kind of bubbling up from the left.
So in response to these conservative challenges, some groups have pushed back by trying to remove religious literature. Even the Bible.
Yeah, imagine that. There have been calls for the Bible to be removed from some Texas school districts, citing things like vulgarity or violence within the text.
Mirroring the exact reasons used to challenge other books.
Precisely. It really underscores this kind of profound irony in censorship, doesn't it? The tools you use to suppress one viewpoint can easily be turned right back around and used against others. It's a cycle.
A cycle that, once you start it, seems incredibly hard to stop.
Which leads us straight to a really key question. What actually happens when these, deeply felt community disagreements over library books? What happens when they escalate? When they hit the federal courts?
Right, because that's where you really test the constitutional principles, isn't it?
It is. And that brings us squarely to Little v. Llano County. It's become this crucial ongoing case study for understanding modern book banning.
So where did Little v. Llano County even start?
Well, its genesis really goes back to 2021 with something that quickly became kind of infamous.
Yeah.
The Krause list.
Ah, yes, the Krause list.
Right. Republican State Representative Matt Krause, he's in the Texas House. He put together this list of, get this, 850 books.
850, wow.
Yeah. And his stated goal was to find materials that might make students feel discomfort, guilt, anguish, or any other form of psychological distress because of their race or sex.
That phrasing sounds familiar.
It does. And while it was framed that way, it was pretty widely seen and likely intended as a direct targeting of books about critical race theory and LGBTQ plus identity. It marked a pretty clear ideological starting point for the challenges that came next.
So that list acted like a catalyst.
It really did. It galvanized various activist groups down in Llano County, Texas, and they started demanding the removal of 17 specific books from their local public library system.
17 specific titles. And did the county react?
Oh, they reacted quickly. The local pressure translated into action. In December 2021, Llano County officials took the pretty unusual step of just closing all 3 of their libraries.
Closing them entirely. For what?
They just vaguely described it as inventory. But following this closure, the library director, apparently acting under orders from county officials, systematically removed all 17 of those challenged books from the shelves.
Okay, so what kind of books were we talking about? You said 17.
It was a pretty broad range, actually, but they all fell under that umbrella of content these groups found objectionable. For instance, several had LGBTQ plus themes. You had Jazz Jennings' memoir, Being Jazz, My Life as a Transgender Teen.
I've heard of that one.
Yeah, and Jonathan Evason's novel Lawn Boy. That one drew a lot of controversy for passages describing nudity and male genitalia, particularly a scene involving a massage. Then there were others like Freak Boy, Spinning, Shine, Gabi, A Girl in Pieces, and Under the Moon, a Catwoman tale.
Okay, so LGBTQ plus themes. What else?
Books dealing with racial issues were also on the list, like Susan Campbell Bartoletti's They Called Themselves the KKK, The Birth of an American Terrorist Group.
It's a history book about the KKK.
Right, and Isabel Wilkerson's critically acclaimed book cast, The Origins of Our Discontents.
Wow, cast. That's a major work.
It is, and then you get to the ones that became, well, maybe affectionately, maybe infamously known as the butt and fart books.
Chuckles. Okay, I have to hear this. The butt and fart books.
Seriously, titles like I Need a New Butt by Don McMillan and its sequels, My Butt is So Noisy and I Broke My Butt.
No way.
Oh, yes. Plus the whole Farting Leprechaun series. Larry the Farting Leprechaun, Freddy the Farting Snowman.
You know, it's almost impossible to talk about this case without acknowledging the sheer absurdity, maybe even the humor, of titles like Larry the Farting Leprechaun being caught up in serious federal court battles. It certainly gives us a different kind of deep dive into children's literature, doesn't it?
It truly does. And what it really spotlights is just how incredibly broad and, yeah, at times seemingly trivial the challenged materials can become before they get sucked into these really complex, high-stakes constitutional fights. It's honestly fascinating how quickly a book about, well, a farting leprechaun can become the focus of a major legal precedent testing the First Amendment.
So beyond the humorous titles, what else was removed?
Well, another children's book that caused a stir was Marie Sendek's classic In the Night Kitchen.
In the Night Kitchen, really?
Yeah, because it contains drawings of a naked toddler. This led to claims of pornographic nudity, despite its long history as, you know, a beloved children's book.
Ah, okay.
And then there was It's Perfectly Normal: Changing Bodies, Growing Up, Sex, and Sexual Health. That's by Roby H. Harris and Michael Emberley.
Ah, the sex ed book.
Right. Intended for preteens, it had cartoon depictions of sexual activity and development. That sparked a huge debate about whether it was suitable for 10-year-olds, whether that direct factual approach was appropriate for a public library.
And it wasn't just physical books, right? Didn't they do something with ebooks too?
That's a crucial point, yes. In addition to removing those 17 print books, the library system completely shut down patron access to over 17,000 ebooks through the Overdrive software.
17,000. What was the justification for that?
The library claimed its existing filters couldn't adequately block sexual activity from children across such a massive digital collection. So they just cut off this huge amount of digital access entirely.
So people in Llano County lost access to thousands of books overnight. How did the community respond to that?
Well, 7 library patrons decided to take a stand. They filed a lawsuit in March 2022. They sued the county judge, the commissioners, and the new library advisory board.
And that new board included members of the activist group that wanted the books gone in the first place.
That's right. Which, you know, raised some eyebrows. The legal battle started unfolding pretty quickly. The district court actually issued an initial ruling granting a temporary injunction.
Meaning the books had to go back on the shelves.
For the time being, yes. The court found there was a substantial motivation by the county to deny access to ideas they just didn't agree with. And significantly, the court also suggested that public libraries function as limited public forums.
Okay, limited public forums. What does that mean legally?
It's a legal designation. If a space is a limited public forum, it means the government can set some rules, but it generally can't discriminate based on viewpoint. So they couldn't ban books just because they disliked the ideas inside.
Got it. So the district court sided with the patrons initially. What happened next?
The case went up to the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals. A 3-judge panel gave a decision in June 2024. It was a 2-1 split.
Close call.
Very. They partially affirmed the injunction, ordering 8 of the original 17 books to be returned.
Only 8, not all of them.
Right. And here's where it gets interesting. While the panel generally agreed on the idea of a patron's right to receive information and used that substantial motivation test from the lower court,
they couldn't agree on which books actually met the standard for removal.
Exactly. They couldn't agree on whether books should be removed based on vulgarity or educational suitability. They were divided on It's Perfectly Normal, for example, and even on some of the Butt and Ferk books.
So even the appellate judges couldn't agree on what counts as vulgar or unsuitable in this context.
Precisely. It really highlighted just how complex and, frankly, subjective these terms become in a legal fight, especially when mixed with concerns about viewpoint discrimination.
So this disagreement, this legal back and forth, where did it lead?
It led to a really crucial development, an en banc rehearing that was scheduled for late September 2024.
En banc, meaning the whole court.
Yes, the entire active bench of the Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals, not just that 3-judge panel. The fact that the full court felt the need to re-examine the case tells you just how high the stakes are and how deep the divisions are among the judges themselves on these fundamental First Amendment issues. It signals that the legal principles here are far from settled.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting, legally speaking, because these arguments, like in Llano County, they often circle back to this landmark Supreme Court case from 1982, Board of Education v. PICO.
Ah, PICO. The case everyone cites, but nobody seems to fully agree on what it means.
Exactly. So what did PICO actually say? Or maybe more accurately, what did it not quite manage to say definitively? And why is its influence still so debated today?
Well, the background, the Island Trees case, as it's known, started in Long Island, New York. Students there challenged their school board's decision to pull 11 books from the school libraries.
And this wasn't just random. There was a reason behind it.
Right. It happened after some school board members went to this politically conservative conference, PMYU, Parents of New York United, and they got a list of books PMYU considered objectionable.
So they came back with a list.
They did. The board set up its own review committee, but then basically ignored the committee's recommendations and only put 2 of the books back.
So what was the students' argument against this?
It was pretty straightforward and actually quite powerful. They argued the removals were driven by an impermissible desire to suppress ideas, not, they claimed, a justifiable reason like removing books with actual vulgarities and sexual explicitness.
They were saying the board just didn't like the ideas in the books.
Essentially, yes. That the board acted out of this impermissible desire to suppress ideas simply because those ideas clashed with the board members' own personal or political views. And they argued this motivation violated the students' First Amendment rights.
And how did the Supreme Court rule?
Well, the court ultimately sided with the students, but in a very specific, almost procedural way. They didn't issue some broad ruling saying you can't ban these books. Instead, they sent the case back down for a trial.
Back for trial? To determine what?
To determine the school board's true motivation. Was it really about suppressing ideas, or was it about something else, like legitimate educational concerns? This was crucial because it shifted the legal focus away from the content of the books themselves and onto the intent behind removing them.
Okay, so the intent matters.
Yeah.
And Justice Brennan wrote an important opinion, right? Even if it wasn't a majority.
Exactly. The Justice Brennan's plurality opinion, and it's critical to remember it was just 4 justices, not a majority of 5, laid out some really foundational ideas. He made this crucial distinction between, say, curriculum and classroom materials, where schools obviously have broad authority
To decide what's taught, what's required reading.
Right. Versus the optional reading you find in the school library. Library books, he argued, are optional rather than required reading.
So the library is different.
Very different in his view. He described the school library, much like any other public library, as a place dedicated to quiet, to knowledge, and to beauty. And in that space, he stressed, students must always remain free to inquire, to study, and to evaluate a whole range of ideas.
That sounds like the right to receive information idea.
That's exactly it. This supported the concept that free speech isn't just about expressing your own ideas, but also about having access to information from different viewpoints so you can form your own ideas. The plurality argued that if the school board's substantial motivation was simply to deny students access to ideas they disagreed with, that violated the First Amendment. It was a powerful statement about intellectual freedom in schools.
But you said it wasn't a majority opinion. That seems really important for how it's used later.
It's hugely important, and honestly, it's what makes PICO so fascinating and, frankly, frustrating for lower courts. Despite being cited all the time, it's incredibly difficult to apply consistently because it was so fractured. No single opinion got a majority.
So it doesn't set a clear legal rule.
Not really. In fact, our own Fifth Circuit, in a case called Muir v. Alabama Educational Television Commission way back in 1982, said flat out that PICO has no precedential value on these First Amendment issues, precisely because no single opinion commanded a majority.
Wow. So right from the start, its authority was questioned.
Exactly. And the recent Little Unbanked decision explicitly reaffirms that view. It just highlights this ongoing challenge. Everyone points to PICO, but nobody can quite agree on what rule, if any, it actually established.
So if Brennan had 4 votes for his view, what were the other justices thinking?
Well, the court was really split. You had Brennan's plurality of 4 arguing viewpoint discrimination was unconstitutional. Then you had the crucial swing vote, Justice White.
The 5th vote.
Kind of. He concurred in the judgment, meaning he agreed they should send the case back for trial to figure out the board's motivation. But, and this is absolutely critical, he explicitly refused to weigh in on the First Amendment issues themselves until the facts were clearer.
He punted.
Basically, yes. He famously said he didn't want to decide difficult First Amendment issues in a largely uncharted field without knowing the facts first. His caution meant he wasn't actually endorsing Brennan's First Amendment theory, which really undercut its binding power.
Okay, so that's 5 justices. What about the other 4?
They dissented. Chief Justice Berger, along with Justices Rehnquist, Powell, and O'Connor, they largely rejected this broad right-to-receive information idea in the school context.
Why?
They argued it conflicted with the school's inculcative function.
Their role in teaching values, shaping citizens.
Exactly. They also argued, look, these books aren't truly being suppressed. Kids can probably find them in public libraries anyway, so there's no real denial of access.
But did even the dissenters think schools could just ban books for any political reason?
That's another fascinating wrinkle. No. Even these dissenting justices, generally more conservative, they cheerfully conceded, as they put it, that school boards cannot act in a narrowly partisan or political manner or engage in the official suppression of ideas.
So even they saw limits somewhere.
Yes. So the real takeaway from PICO isn't some clear rule. It's more about revealing this deep, ongoing struggle. How do you balance free expression with the school board's authority or community values? And because there's no single majority opinion, that struggle just continues to play out in cases like Llano County today.
Okay, so fast forward to Little v. Llano County. How did the majority in that on-bank decision interpret this messy PICO precedent?
They took a very specific and pretty impactful stance. They essentially argue that the First Amendment only protects what they call a negative right.
A negative right, meaning?
Meaning the government can't stop you from receiving information exchanged between private citizens. Like they can't censor your mail or stop you reading a newspaper someone else published.
Okay, so the government can't interfere with private speech exchange.
Right. But the little majority argues this does not mean the government has an obligation to provide you with information, especially not through taxpayer-funded library books. To them, the library isn't some guaranteed fountain of all knowledge the government must maintain.
So no positive right to demand the government give you access to specific books in its library.
That's their argument. And they go further, saying trying to apply a broad right to receive in libraries would be a practical nightmare. It would lead to endless lawsuits.
What a nightmare.
Think about it, they say. How would judges possibly decide consistently if a book was removed because officials genuinely disliked its ideas versus because it was legitimately considered vulgar or maybe just inaccurate, poorly written, or even physically falling apart?
Yeah, I can see how that line could get blurry.
Extremely blurry. And they point to the fact that even the original 3-judge panel in Little couldn't agree on whether books like It's Perfectly Normal or those butt and fart books met the threshold for removal. If appellate judges can't agree, how can you have a workable standard? That's their point.
And also mentioned the slippery slope argument, right?
Yes, they did. They warn that if removing books is forbidden based on this right to receive, then logically shouldn't refusing to buy books in the first place also be forbidden, because that's also denying access, right?
Okay.
And this, they claim, would essentially force libraries to buy any book a patron demands. It could even lead to lawsuits demanding libraries get more funding just to accommodate every single request.
That sounds potentially chaotic.
That's the picture they paint. Plus, they argue, removing a book from one library doesn't actually prevent access entirely. You can often find it online, buy it, borrow it from another library system.
So it's not really a First Amendment issue of suppression, just a matter of how taxpayer money is spent?
That's their framing. It's about resource allocation, not censorship. And they pivot cleverly, using standard library practices to support this. They point to library weeding manuals, like Texas's official See-or-Rue guide, or even the ALA's own handbook.
Weeding guides. How do they support the argument?
Well, the majority points out that these guides actually advise removing books based on things that could be seen as viewpoint. Things like biased, racist, or sexist terminology, or outdated philosophies, or outdated ideas about gender roles. Think about the removal of certain Dr. Seuss books for racist imagery.
So they're saying librarians already make viewpoint-based decisions when they weed.
That's the argument. They conclude by saying something like, the First Amendment does not force public libraries to have a flat earth section, implying libraries inherently curate based on content and viewpoint all the time.
So, wait. If a weeding guide tells a librarian to remove a book because it has, say, racist terminology, that's supposedly viewpoint discrimination that the First Amendment doesn't stop librarians from doing. It feels like a bit of a head-scratcher, doesn't it? Are they saying librarians already discriminate based on content, so why can't a county board do the same, even if their reasons are more political? It seems to blur a really important line.
You've absolutely hit the nail on the head. That's the core tension, and it completely flips the script on how many people view professional library curation. The little majority is essentially arguing that any selection or deselection is an expressive choice, a form of speech by the library itself.
So they're trying to erase the distinction between professional standards and political motives.
They're definitely blurring it. Their argument is, if you can choose what to include based on criteria, you can choose what to exclude based on criteria. Any decision about a book, buying it, keeping it, removing it, is inherently a content-based decision reflecting the library's and, by extension, the government's judgment.
So the library isn't a neutral forum for ideas, but a curated message.
That's their position. It's a curated collection reflecting community standards, educational goals, whatever the library authority decides. And because it's the library speaking through its collection, viewpoint neutrality, as traditionally understood for forums, doesn't necessarily apply in the same way. It's a fundamental challenge to the idea of the library as a marketplace of diverse ideas.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. We know PICO was about a school library, and Little is about a public library. Does that difference actually matter legally? And how does this tie back to that voodoo and hoodoo case, Campbell, that we started with? It feels like these different settings, school versus public, might demand different legal rules, right? That seems central to understanding the contrasting First Amendment standards.
It's absolutely central. And yes, let's revisit Campbell. As you said, it involved removing voodoo and hoodoo from a Louisiana school library. Parents were really upset about the second half, that how-to spell guide.
They saw it as encouraging harmful behavior.
Exactly. Harmful, antisocial behavior. They felt it crossed the line from history into being a dangerous instruction manual. And they specifically pointed to those graphic spell ingredients we mentioned earlier: menstrual blood, pubic hair, semen, urine, excrement. That level of detail really fueled the controversy.
So how did the court rule in Campbell back then?
Campbell's ruling, which was heavily influenced by Justice Brennan's thinking in PICO, tried to walk a fine line. It basically said a school library could not remove a book just to deny students access to ideas the school board disagreed with.
Okay, so no thought policing.
Right. But the court said the school could remove a book for reasons like pervasive vulgarity or if it lacked educational suitability.
Trying to distinguish between censoring ideas and maintaining appropriate standards for a school environment.
Precisely. It was an attempt to let schools set standards without becoming outright censors of thought. Allow for curation based on age appropriateness or relevance, but not just because you don't like the message.
Okay, so that was the Campbell standard for school libraries in the Fifth Circuit.
Yeah.
How does the Little-on-Bank decision interact with that?
This is a huge point. The Little-on-Bank majority makes a very direct, very impactful move. It explicitly overrules Campbell.
Overrules it entirely. Wow.
Yes, this isn't just tweaking it. It's a major shift in the legal landscape for the Fifth Circuit. It dramatically changes the First Amendment standards applied to libraries, both school and public, within its jurisdiction.
Why did they overrule it? What was their reasoning?
They give a few key reasons. First, they said Campbell was based on a mistaken PICO interpretation. Specifically, it relied on that idea of a broad right to receive information from PICO that allowed students to challenge removals. But, as we've discussed, the Little majority argues PICO has no real precedential value because it was fractured, and that a majority of PICO justices actually rejected such a broad right in schools.
So, built on a shaky foundation, in their view.
That's their argument. Second, they argued Campbell was internally inconsistent. They called that distinction Campbell tried to make between denying ideas versus removing for vulgarity suitability a faux distinction.
Why faux?
Because, they argued, especially in a case like voodoo and hoodoo, the line is basically meaningless. If a book tells you how to use bodily fluids and spells, removing it because it's vulgar is denying access to those specific ideas. The two things are inseparable, making Campbell's distinction artificial and unworkable in practice.
Okay, that makes sense from their perspective. Any other reasons?
Yeah, finally, they claimed Campbell just hadn't had much impact anyway. They said it played no role in later controversies, was rarely cited, and so overruling it wouldn't upend library administration. Basically, they argued it was irrelevant.
But the dissent disagreed with that last point, right?
Strongly. The dissent argued that maybe the lack of lawsuits under Campbell actually meant the standard was workable, that it provided enough clarity that people weren't constantly suing. So, the absence of litigation could mean it was effective, not irrelevant. That difference really shows the opposing judicial philosophies here.
So the dissent fought hard to keep Campbell and that PICO-influenced framework alive.
They did, and they strongly defended the distinction between school and public libraries, which they see as fundamental. They argue passionately that PICO, even fractured, is binding precedent.
How can it be binding if it was fractured?
They point to Justice White's concurrence. Remember, he agreed they needed to investigate the school board's motivation. The dissent says that agreement that motivation matters and needs fact-finding before you jump to constitutional conclusions is the binding part. They emphasize that 5 of the justices in PICO agreed that some motivations would be unconstitutional.
So the principle that motivation matters is the key takeaway.
According to the dissent, yes. And they see PICO as being judicially restrained, sending it back for facts, rather than making a broad rule. They quote the idea that courts shouldn't anticipate a question of constitutional law in advance of the necessity of deciding it.
What about that point that even the PICO dissenters saw limits?
The Little dissent hammers that home. They remind everyone that even Justices Rehnquist, Berger, and Powell in the PICO dissent cheerfully conceded that school boards can't act in a narrowly partisan or political manner or for the official suppression of ideas. The Little dissent argues the majority, by tossing out Campbell, is essentially ignoring the reasoning of a supermajority of the court on that core principle.
That's a strong claim.
It is. And then there's the crucial distinction. The PICO dissenters themselves explicitly differentiated between school libraries and public libraries.
How so?
Their argument for why it was okay to remove books from the school library was partly because those books would still be available in public libraries. That implies public libraries have a different, maybe higher standard for free expression.
So if the PICO dissenters were essentially saying, don't worry, kids, you can get it at the public library if your school library won't carry it. And now we're seeing a legal precedent that allows banning from public libraries. That feels like a significant and deeply impactful shift, doesn't it? It's like pulling the rug out from under the very alternative they offered to justify restrictions in schools. It seems to undermine the whole idea of accessible information for everyone.
It absolutely does. And the Little dissent highlights this exact point, really underscoring that critical public library distinction. By relying on the public library as that alternative universal access point, the PICO dissenters implicitly suggested public libraries serve a different function, carrying a broader obligation to provide access.
Because a public library isn't trying to inculcate values like a school is.
Precisely. It doesn't have that same inculcative function. It's not primarily about shaping young minds according to a specific curriculum or ideology. Traditionally, it's seen as a space for freewheeling inquiry, open to all ages, all ideas, a place to foster independent thought, self-education.
So the implications of a little ruling are huge then.
They are substantial, because if a public library can now, under this new interpretation, freely remove books for basically any reason, including viewpoint, then that alternative access point, the one even past Supreme Court justices relied upon, is effectively gone. It shrinks the marketplace of ideas for the entire community. It strikes at the very core of what many believe public libraries exist to do. It's a fundamental rethinking of their role in society.
Okay, let's tackle the really big legal weapon the little en banc majority deployed. This government speech doctrine. Now, this is a fascinating, if maybe a bit abstract legal concept, but applying it to a library, a place filled with books by countless different authors, that feels, well, like a stretch, or at least a very new interpretation. What does it actually mean for a library to be speaking through its collection? It seems so different from, say, a government press release.
It does feel different, and that's where the controversy lies. But let's break down what government speech generally means. At its core, it's about recognizing when the government itself is conveying its own message,
as opposed to just providing a platform for others to speak.
Exactly. Think of clear examples. A presidential inaugural address, that's the president laying out the government's vision. Or army recruiting posters saying, "I want you." That's a direct message from a government agency. Even something like the old beef, its What's for Dinner campaign, funded by the Department of Agriculture, was considered government speech.
Okay, so when the government is talking for itself.
Right, and in those cases, the First Amendment doesn't force the government to include opposing viewpoints. It gets to choose its message. Citizens can protest or vote against it, but they can't sue to force the government to say something different.
But how does that apply to something like a library or museum collection, which involves selecting speech from private individuals, authors, artists?
That's where it gets more nuanced. The doctrine also covers situations where the government's expressive activity involves the selection and presentation of private speech. A museum curating an exhibit is a good example.
Well, each painting is by a private artist.
The museum's act of choosing which paintings to display, how to arrange them, that selection itself is seen as the museum's own expressive act. It's conveying a message like, these works are significant, valuable, worth seeing.
Has this idea been applied to libraries before Little?
There have been suggestions and related rulings. The Supreme Court's plurality opinion in United States v. American Library Association back in 2003 hinted at this, suggesting libraries' discretion in shaping collections was an expressive act. They even quoted a manual saying the librarian's job is to separate out the gold from the garbage.
Implying selection is inherently judgmental and expressive.
Exactly. And other cases touched on it. Sumim v. Pleasant Grove City, 2009, found a city displaying donated monuments was government speech. A D.C. Circuit case, PETA v. Gittins, 2005, actually said explicitly, with respect to the public library, the government speaks through its selection of which books to put on the shelves and which books to exclude. And our own Fifth Circuit in Curis v. Miller, 2005, ruled that the Texas State Board of Education selecting textbooks was government speech. So the idea that selection is speech isn't entirely new.
Okay, so how did the little majority specifically try to apply this to the Llano County Library? They used something called the shirt left factors, right?
Yes, they did. The shirt left test came from a Supreme Court case about flying flags at Boston City Hall. It uses 3 factors to figure out if something is government speech. First, the history of the expression. Second, how the public perceives who is speaking. And third, how much control the government has over the message. The little majority argues all 3 point towards library collections being government speech.
All right, let's take them one by one. First, history of expression. How does library history support this?
They argue that public libraries from way back in the mid-19th century were funded by government specifically to strengthen the educational mission and were curated to foster education and virtue. They weren't just warehouses for books.
They had a purpose, a message.
That's the claim. They point out early libraries often excluded novels, seeing them as poisonous or trashy. The Petersburg Town Library in 1834, for example, apparently had only 2% novels. Their goal was explicitly stated as promoting virtue and morality.
So historically, libraries were actively shaping collections based on values.
According to the majority, yes. And they argue that even though the definition of worthwhile books has changed drastically, today's libraries still convey the message these books are worth reading through the very act of selection and exclusion.
And they used the library's own weeding guides as evidence here too, didn't they?
Yes, that's where it gets particularly interesting, maybe even controversial. They point to the Texas CRW Guide and the ALA Handbook again. These guides advise removing books with biased, racist, or sexist terminology, outdated philosophies, or outdated ideas about gender roles.
So it's not just what libraries keep on the shelves, but what they actively weed out. That's supposedly a form of government speech. And if an official weeding guide tells you to remove a book because it contains, say, overtly racist views, that's considered viewpoint discrimination that the First Amendment doesn't protect librarians from doing, or rather doesn't forbid the government from doing. It's a bit of a logical pretzel, isn't it? It almost feels like they're saying librarians already discriminate by selecting what they deem appropriate according to professional standards, so why can't a library board do the same based on their community's values? This seems to fundamentally blur the line between neutral professional curation and politically motivated censorship.
That's a very sharp point, and it is the core tension here. You've articulated it perfectly. The little majority is arguing that even professional curation is, at its heart, a form of expressive choice by the government entity running the library. They are trying to blur that line you just drew, essentially saying that the power to select inherently includes the power to exclude, and any decision about a book is a content-based decision reflecting the library's judgment.
So the library is speaking by saying this is appropriate or this is not.
That's their argument. Therefore, the library isn't just a neutral forum, it's a curated collection. And if it's the government's speech, then challenges based on viewpoint discrimination under the First Amendment might not apply in the same way they would in a true public forum. It fundamentally reframes the library's role.
Okay, what about the second shirtlift factor? Public perception. How does the public see it?
The majority argues that a reasonable patron understands the books on the shelf reflect choices made by the library board or the librarians, not the authors themselves. Their example is, if you can't find Stephen King, you complain to the library, not to Stephen King.
Implying the public sees the library, the government entity, as the speaker making the selection.
Right. They directly disagree with the Eighth Circuit's ruling in a case called GLBT Youth v. Reynolds. The Eighth Circuit said the public wouldn't see library books as government speech because a diverse collection would just sound like incoherent babbling too many different voices.
But the little majority says that's missing the point.
Yes. They say the library's message isn't in the content of each individual book, but in the overall act of selection, curation, and display. Making certain things available and others not, that is the message.
And the third factor, extent of government control.
Here, they just reiterate that public libraries have always actively shaped and controlled their collections for specific purposes: educational, civic, moral, using selection, and weeding criteria. This history of control, they argue, further shows the collection is government expression.
So putting it all together, their conclusion is library collections are government speech.
That's the bottom line from the little majority. And the huge consequence of that conclusion is that decisions about which books to include or remove are therefore not subject to First Amendment challenges from patrons claiming viewpoint discrimination. Because, the argument goes, citizens don't have a First Amendment right to dictate what the government says.
Wow, that's a really sweeping conclusion. But the dissent pushed back hard on this government speech idea, right?
Oh, absolutely. The dissent called it a First Amendment collapse and more than a sleight of hand. They argued it dangerously turns freedom of speech into government speech.
How did they counter the legal arguments?
They argued it contradicts other Supreme Court precedents. They pointed to Mittal v. Tam, 2017, the case about trademarks. The Supreme Court rejected the idea that trademarks are government speech because the government just registers them. It doesn't endorse their viewpoint. Trademarks aren't traditionally government messages.
So the dissent sees libraries as more like trademark registration hosting private speech than like a curated government message.
Exactly. A library facilitates access to many private voices. It doesn't adopt them all as its own. They also pointed to Justice Alito's concurrence in Shurtleff itself, the flag case the majority relied on. Alito specifically warned against using the government speech doctrine as a cover for censorship.
Using the majority's own cited case against them.
Precisely. Alito wrote that naked censorship, based on viewpoint, cannot fall beyond the reach of the First Amendment. The dissent argued the majority was doing exactly what Alito warned against.
Did the dissent note if other courts had applied government speech to libraries like this?
Yes, they emphasize that no other court in the country has held that removing books from a public library is government speech. In fact, the Eighth Circuit, as we mentioned, explicitly rejected it. So the Fifth Circuit is really out on a limb here.
And there was a procedural issue, too, about waiving the argument.
Right. The dissent pointed out that the defendants in Little hadn't even made the government speech argument seriously at the initial panel stage. They essentially waived it. So for the en banc majority to then suddenly adopt it so strongly was, in the dissent's view, surprising and perhaps improper.
So instead of government speech, the dissent preferred the limited public forum idea.
They implied that was a more appropriate framework. The district court had initially used that analysis, which would forbid viewpoint discrimination. The dissent suggests the majority used government speech to sidestep that more traditional and potentially more protective analysis for libraries as places meant for accessing diverse private expression.
Okay, we've dug deep into the legal weeds here, Pico, Campbell, Little, government speech. But stepping back, beyond these complex arguments, what does this all actually mean for us? For the people who use these libraries every day? When courts make these kinds of rulings on book banning, what are the real-world consequences we should be thinking about?
That's the crucial question, isn't it? And the implications are pretty profound. For starters, you risk undermining core democratic principles and the idea of free thought itself.
It's not just about one side versus the other.
No. As Stephen Pico himself said way back when, censorship was not simply a right-wing versus left-wing issue, but something offensive to the vast majority of Americans. When you start limiting the viewpoints available in public spaces like libraries, you inevitably restrict the information people have access to.
Which makes it harder to make informed decisions.
Exactly. It hinders that whole marketplace of ideas concept where ideas compete freely and people can weigh different perspectives. If you narrow the range of available ideas, you threaten the ability to make informed democratic choices. You might even stifle the emergence of better ideas through open debate.
So societies that allow widespread book banning could actually be weakening free thinking itself.
It's a real danger. It can erode the principles of freedom and democratic representation over time. And there's that irony we touched on earlier, too. Censorship often hits unintended targets.
The whole what goes around comes around idea.
Precisely. When you create or endorse a precedent for banning books based on certain objections, you inadvertently open the door for that same precedent to be used against any group, any content.
Like the example of religious texts being challenged using the same arguments.
Yes. Many of the issues targeted in challenged books, violence, sex, challenging minority, are arguably present in religious texts like the Bible too. So you see retaliatory challenges, maybe using separation of church and state arguments, or just mirroring the language used to ban other books.
So if you support banning books you dislike, you might find your own sacred texts targeted next.
It's a very real possibility. It creates this atmosphere where suppressing speech becomes normalized, and any group's materials could become vulnerable. It shows how censorship isn't really about specific values. It's a tool that can boomerang back on anyone.
And beyond these broader societal effects, who bears the brunt of these bans most directly?
Well, perhaps most significantly, book banning disproportionately harms the most vulnerable members of our society. Specifically, children and people who are socioeconomically disadvantaged.
How so? Why those groups in particular?
Think about children first. As minors, they already have limited political rights, right? They can't vote, they can't run for office, they have less power to influence policies that directly impact them.
So book banning hits them when they're already less able to fight back politically.
Exactly. It affects their access to information, crucial for their development, their understanding of the world, their ability to form their own thoughts at a time when they have the least political recourse.
And what about the socioeconomic angle?
People with lower socioeconomic status often face systemic barriers that limit their effective political rights too. Maybe lack of resources, lack of time for advocacy, feeling disconnected from the political process.
And educationally.
Often, children from lower-income families attend schools that are underfunded, with fewer resources like well-stocked libraries. An unstable home life can add another layer of challenge to their education.
So libraries become even more important for them.
Immensely important. Public libraries really serve as these vital educational hubs and true equalizers. They exist to bridge these societal gaps by offering free resources to everyone. For many people, especially kids and those with fewer economic advantages, the library isn't just one option. It's their primary, maybe their only, access point to a wide range of books, information, computers, educational programs like summer reading.
I remember you mentioned an anecdote about someone growing up in Llano County itself.
Yes, the source material mentioned an author whose first introduction to true freedom was their Llano County library. That really highlights the vital, formative role these places play, especially for individuals who don't have easy alternatives, like buying every book they want to read.
So when books are removed, it hits these groups the hardest.
It absolutely does. They rely on the library the most, so removing resources disproportionately affects them, potentially limiting their opportunities and reinforcing existing disadvantages. The Little Dissent actually called it disturbingly flippant and legally unsound to just suggest patrons can buy the books elsewhere.
Because many simply can't afford to.
Exactly. For many, the library is the only gateway.
And what about the argument some parents make that they should have the right to decide what's appropriate for kids? How does that fit with public access?
That's a really important distinction the Little Dissent also raised. They emphasize that while parents absolutely have the right to guide their own children's reading,
that right doesn't extend to controlling what other people's children can read in a public library.
Precisely. The dissent stated, no parent has the authority in a library system to control what somebody else's children read. Your right to parent your child doesn't translate into a right to curate the public library for the entire community. Libraries already have systems like age-appropriate sections or requiring parental permission for checkouts that allow parents to manage access for their own kids without restricting it for everyone else.
So the Llano County context, being a place where many might rely heavily on the library, just makes this ruling feel even more impactful for those vulnerable communities.
It really does. It underscores how these legal decisions aren't just abstract. They have very real, very direct consequences for people's ability to access information and opportunity, especially for those who have the fewest alternatives. Hashtag tag outro.
So this deep dive has really shown us, hasn't it, that seemingly simple act of taking a book off a library shelf. Well, it can ignite this incredibly complex legal firestorm. We're talking fundamental questions about the First Amendment, the 14th Amendment.
Absolutely. It digs right into core issues of what it means to be well-informed in a democracy, who ultimately gets to decide what information is available, and really the fundamental nature of public access to knowledge itself.
With consequences, as we just discussed, that ripple through communities and hit some folks much harder than others.
And what's critically important to take away here is that these discussions, these legal battles, they are far from over. The precedents are still very much in flux.
Leaving a lot of uncertainty.
Deep uncertainty about the future of library collections, sure, but more broadly, about the right to access information in a free society. That constant tension between institutional control, whether it's a school board or county commissioners, and individual liberty, especially when it involves the marketplace of ideas. That remains one of the defining challenges of our time. It really pushes us, or should push us, to keep reflecting on the foundational principles that are supposed to underpin our democracy.